What happens when Hollywood's most respected veteran meets a talk show host who thinks he can push buttons without consequences? Well, buckle up, because what you're about to witness is one of the most uncomfortable television moments in recent memory, and it all started so innocently. If you want to see how this explosive exchange unfolds, and why Harrison Ford walked off set, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, telling me which celebrity interview disaster you want to see covered next. The Good Morning America studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Harrison Ford had arrived to promote his latest film, looking every bit the weathered action star that audiences had adored for decades. At 78 years old, Ford still carried that unmistakable presence, that quiet intensity that made him Han Solo, Indiana Jones, and countless other iconic characters. But today, something was different. There was a tension in his shoulders, a sharpness in his eyes that suggested he wasn't in the mood for games. Michael Strahan, the former NFL star turned television personality, was in his element. The bright studio lights, the cameras, the controlled chaos of live television, this was his domain now. He had built a career on his easy charm and ability to make guests feel comfortable, but lately, his interviews had taken on a more aggressive edge. Some called it confidence, others called it arrogance. Today, it would prove to be something else entirely. "Harrison, great to have you back on the show," Strahan said, flashing his signature smile as they settled into the interview chairs. The cameras rolled, capturing what would become one of the most talked-about television moments of the year. Ford nodded curtly, his hands clasped in his lap. "Thanks for having me, Michael. Now, I have to ask." Strahan leaned forward, his voice taking on that tone that regular viewers knew meant he was about to dig deeper. "There's been a lot of talk about your, shall we say, difficult reputation on set. Some people call you demanding, others say you're just passionate. What's your take on that?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ford's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. The seasoned actor had dealt with thousands of interviews over his 5-decade career. He knew when a host was fishing for drama, and he knew how to shut it down. But today, he decided to engage. "I think," Ford said slowly, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly quality, "that when you've been doing this, as long as I have, you learn the difference between being professional and being walked over. Some people mistake high standards for being difficult." Strahan chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "High standards? Sure. But come on, Harrison. We've all heard the stories. Crew members afraid to approach you, directors having to tiptoe around your mood swings. That sounds like more than just high standards to me." The studio fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something was shifting. Ford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "Michael, I'm curious. Where exactly are you getting these stories? Because in my experience, the people who actually work with me, the ones who know what really happens on a film set, they tend to have a different perspective." "Well, I mean, it's common knowledge in Hollywood," Strahan said, waving his hand dismissively. "I talk to people in the industry all the time. They tell me things." "They tell you things," Ford repeated, his tone flat. "And you just accept these anonymous sources without question? That's interesting journalism." The tension was palpable now. Strahan's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered, but Ford had noticed. The actor had spent decades reading people, understanding their motivations, and right now he was reading Michael Strahan like an open book. "Look, I'm just asking the questions that people want answered," Strahan said, his voice rising slightly. "Our viewers deserve to know what their favorite stars are really like behind the scenes." "Do they?" Ford asked, leaning back in his chair. "Or do they deserve to be entertained by gossip and speculation? Because there's a difference, Michael, between journalism and tabloid sensationalism." The words hit their mark. Strahan's face flushed slightly, and his easy television demeanor began to crack. "I think you're being a little unfair here, Harrison. We're having a conversation, not conducting a criminal investigation. Are we having a conversation?" Ford's voice was quiet now, but it carried an edge that made everyone in the studio lean in. "Because it feels more like you're trying to create a moment, manufacture some drama for your ratings. Is that what this is about?" Strahan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The interview was spiraling away from his control, and he could feel it. But instead of pulling back, instead of diffusing the situation, he doubled down. "I think you're being overly sensitive," he said, his voice taking on a condescending tone. "We're just having a friendly chat here. Maybe you need to relax a little bit." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ford stared at Strahan for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "Relax," he repeated. "That's an interesting choice of words, Michael. Tell me, when you were playing football, if a reporter had suggested you just needed to relax after questioning your performance, your work ethic, your character, how would you have responded?" Strahan's smile disappeared entirely. "That's different." "Is it?" Ford leaned forward now, his eyes locked on the host. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're doing exactly what those reporters used to do to you. The only difference is, you're doing it on national television, and you're hiding behind that smile while you do it." The studio was dead silent. Camera operators glanced at each other nervously. The producer in the control room was frantically signaling for a commercial break, but Strahan, his pride wounded and his authority challenged, pressed on. "I think you're projecting here, Harrison," he said, his voice tight. "Maybe you're the one with the problem. Maybe all those stories about your attitude are true after all." Ford stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. The microphone pack attached to his shirt crackled as he adjusted it, and every person in that studio knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Harrison Ford, the man who had faced down movie villains for decades, was about to face down a real one. The silence in the studio was deafening. Harrison Ford remained standing, his presence somehow filling the entire space despite his relatively modest stature. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting to see what would happen next. Michael Strahan, still seated, looked up at the legendary actor with a mixture of defiance and growing unease. "Sit down, Harrison," Strahan said, his voice attempting to regain its authoritative tone. "Let's finish this interview like professionals." Ford didn't move. Instead, he looked down at Strahan with the kind of measured intensity that had made him perfect for roles where words carried more weight than weapons. "Professionals," Ford repeated, his voice carrying a note of bitter amusement. "Michael, let me tell you something about professionalism. A professional does their homework. They research their guests, they prepare meaningful questions, and they treat their interview subjects with basic respect. What you just did, what you've been doing this entire time, that's not professionalism. That's ambush journalism disguised as entertainment." Strahan's jaw tightened. The cameras were still rolling, and he knew that millions of viewers were watching this unfold. His reputation, his carefully crafted television persona, was crumbling in real time. "I resent that implication," Strahan shot back, finally rising from his own chair. "I've been doing this job for years, Harrison. I know how to conduct an interview." "Do you?" Ford's voice was quiet, but it cut through the studio like a blade. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you know how to conduct an interrogation. There's a difference, Michael, and the fact that you can't see it says everything about why you're standing here arguing with me instead of doing your job." The two men stood facing each other now, the interview chairs between them like a barrier in a boxing ring. Strahan was taller, broader, his athletic background evident in his imposing physical presence. But Ford carried himself with the confidence of a man who had stared down real adversity, who had earned his place in Hollywood through talent and perseverance rather than charm and connections. "You want to know what I think?" Strahan's voice was rising now, his carefully maintained television persona slipping away. "I think you're scared. I think you're getting older, you're losing relevance, and you can't handle being asked real questions anymore. You want everyone to just kiss your feet because you played some fictional characters decades ago." The insult hung in the air like a physical blow. Several crew members audibly gasped. Even the sound technicians, hardened veterans of live television, looked shocked. But Ford's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed to relax, as if Strahan had just revealed exactly what he'd suspected all along. "There it is," Ford said, nodding slowly. "That's what this was really about, wasn't it? This whole interview, these questions, this manufactured controversy. You're not interested in my work, my craft, or anything I might have to say that could actually inform or entertain your audience. You just wanted to tear down someone who's accomplished something you never could. I was a professional athlete, Strahan snapped. I achieved plenty. In football, yes, Ford acknowledged. And I respect that. What I don't respect is using that past success as a license to belittle other people's achievements. You were good at football, Michael. That doesn't automatically make you good at this. Strahan's face was flushed now, his composure completely gone. Who do you think you are to lecture me about my job? You're just an actor, Harrison. You pretend to be other people for a living. I deal with real life, real people, real issues. Ford's laugh was short and humorless. Real issues? Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm standing, the only real issue here is your inability to conduct yourself with basic decency. You want to talk about real life? Let me give you some reality, Michael. In real life, when you treat people the way you've treated me today, there are consequences. Are you threatening me? Strahan's voice pitched higher. And for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked genuinely rattled. I'm educating you, Ford replied calmly. See, the thing about respect is that it's earned, not demanded. You can't bully your way into people's admiration, and you can't manufacture credibility by tearing down others. What you're doing right now, this whole performance, it's not making you look strong, Michael. It's making you look desperate. The words hit their target. Strahan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment, it looked like the situation might turn physical. But Ford remained perfectly still, his gaze never wavering. You think you're so much better than everyone else? Strahan said, his voice now barely controlled. Walking around like you're some kind of Hollywood royalty, too good to answer a simple question. I answered your questions, Michael. All of them. What I didn't do was validate your assumptions or play along with your attempt to create controversy where none existed. And apparently, that's what really bothers you. The producer in the control room was frantically signaling for a commercial break, but both men were now completely focused on each other, the television show forgotten. You know what? Strahan said, pointing a finger at Ford. Maybe those stories about you are true. Maybe you really are impossible to work with. Maybe that's why you're here promoting some mediocre action movie instead of doing anything that actually matters. It was a low blow, calculated to wound. Ford's latest film, while not a critical darling, had been a passion project, something he'd spent years developing. Strahan had clearly done enough research to know exactly where to aim his verbal knife. But instead of anger, Ford's expression showed something that was almost pity. Michael, he said quietly, do you hear yourself right now? Do you understand what you're doing? You're so desperate to win this argument, to maintain some illusion of control, that you're willing to insult not just me, but everyone who worked on that film. The writers, the directors, the crew members who poured their hearts into making something they believed in, all so you can score points in a television interview. Strahan opened his mouth to respond, but Ford held up a hand. I'm not finished, he said, and there was something in his tone that made Strahan close his mouth. You want to know what the real difference is between us, Michael? When I make a mistake, when I fail at something, I own it. I learn from it. I don't blame other people. And I don't try to make myself feel better by diminishing their accomplishments. That's called maturity, and it's something you might want to consider developing. The studio fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the tense quiet of anticipation, but rather the heavy stillness that follows a definitive statement. Ford had drawn his line in the sand, and everyone present understood that this confrontation was about to reach its conclusion. The weight of Ford's words settled over the studio like a heavy blanket. Michael Strahan stood there, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled emotion, while Harrison Ford remained as composed as if he were delivering lines in a film. But this wasn't acting. This was real, and everyone watching knew it. Strahan's voice, when he finally found it again, was tight with frustration. You don't get to come on my show and lecture me about maturity, Harrison. This is my house, my rules. Ford's eyebrows raised slightly, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Your house? Michael, this is a television studio, owned by a network that pays both of our salaries today. Neither of us owns this space, but one of us is certainly acting like we belong here more than the other. I've been hosting this show for years. Strahan shot back. I've built relationships with viewers. I've earned my place here. You're just passing through, promoting whatever project your agent booked you for. And there's the problem, Ford said, his voice gaining strength. You see me as just another promotional opportunity, another chance to create a viral moment for your social media clips. You're not interested in having a conversation, Michael. You're interested in having content. The accusation struck home. Strahan's jaw worked silently for a moment before he found his voice again. That's not fair. I interview hundreds of people a year. I can't treat everyone like they're my best friend. I'm not asking you to treat me like your best friend, Ford replied evenly. I'm asking you to treat me like a human being. There's a difference between being professional and being hostile, and you crossed that line the moment you decided to attack my character based on unnamed sources and industry gossip. Strahan's hands were shaking slightly now. Whether from anger or nerves, it was impossible to tell. I was doing my job. I was asking the questions that viewers want answered. Were you? Ford's voice took on a curious tone, as if he were genuinely interested in the answer. Because I've been on hundreds of talk shows, Michael, and I've never had a host open with accusations about my work ethic and personal character. Most professionals start with questions about the project I'm there to promote. But you didn't ask a single question about my film, did you? The realization hit Strahan visibly. His mouth opened, then closed, as he tried to process what Ford had just pointed out. In his eagerness to create drama, to push buttons and generate controversy, he had completely forgotten the basic purpose of the interview. We were getting to that, Strahan stammered. We had time to cover everything. Did we? Ford glanced at his watch, a gesture that seemed casual but carried devastating implications. Because we're 15 minutes into what was supposed to be a 20-minute segment, and you haven't asked me a single question about the work I'm here to discuss. Instead, you've spent our entire time trying to bait me into some kind of meltdown for your cameras. The control room was in chaos now. The producer was frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial, end the segment, or let this unprecedented television moment continue to unfold. But Ford wasn't finished. You want to know what's really sad about this, Michael? You had an opportunity here. You could have asked me about the stunts I still insist on doing at my age, about working with the new generation of actors, about how the film industry has changed over the decades. You could have given your viewers something interesting, something memorable for the right reasons. Instead, you chose this. Strahan's voice was barely above a whisper now. People are interested in the real story behind the celebrity image. The real story. Ford's laugh was sharp, but not unkind. Michael, the real story is that I'm a 78-year-old man who still loves making movies, who still gets excited about telling stories, and who showed up here today, hoping to share that passion with your audience. But you weren't interested in that story, were you? You wanted the scandal, the controversy, the clickbait headline. That's not true, Strahan protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Ford reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. I'm curious, Michael. How long do you think it'll be before this interview is clipped and posted online with a title like Harrison Ford loses it on live TV or Movie star melts down during interview? Because that's what this was really about, wasn't it? Creating a moment that would drive traffic to your show. Strahan's face went pale. The calculated nature of Ford's words, the way he was systematically dismantling not just the interview but the entire motivation behind it, was devastating in its precision. You're wrong, Strahan said, but even he seemed to know how weak it sounded. Ford pocketed his phone and looked directly into the camera, addressing the audience for the first time. Ladies and gentlemen, I came here today to talk about a film that I'm proud of, made with people I respect, and I hope you'll consider seeing. But instead, I've been forced to defend myself against baseless accusations and unprofessional behavior. He turned back to Strahan, his voice softening slightly. Michael, I don't know what happened to you, what changed you from someone who presumably got into this business because you enjoyed connecting with people into whatever this island. But I hope you figure it out, because talent without character is just noise. The words hung in the air like a final judgment. Strahan stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He looked like a man who had just realized he was drowning and had no idea how to swim to shore. Ford reached down and carefully removed his microphone, the small gesture somehow carrying enormous weight. "I think we're done here," he said quietly. "Wait," Strahan said, desperation creeping into his voice. "We can start over. We can talk about your movie. We can do this right." Ford paused, his hand on the microphone pack. For a moment, it seemed like he might reconsider. Then he shook his head slowly. "Michael, in my experience, you can't unring a bell. You showed me who you are today, and more importantly, you showed your viewers who you are. Starting over doesn't change that." With that, Harrison Ford walked off the set, leaving Michael Strahan standing alone among the cameras and lights, the weight of his choices settling around him like dust after an explosion. The great actor had delivered his final line, and unlike in the movies, there would be no second take. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft sound of Ford's footsteps echoing down the hallway as he left the studio. His dignity intact, and his point made. Behind him, Michael Strahan stood in the wreckage of what should have been a routine promotional interview, finally understanding the difference between being tough and being professional, between asking hard questions and simply being hard to watch. That's the power of integrity, folks. When someone like Harrison Ford stands up to a bully, it reminds us all what real strength looks like. Make sure you subscribe for more Hollywood moments that'll leave you speechless, and comment below with your thoughts on whether Strahan crossed the line or if Ford was being too sensitive. What would you have done in that situation?